Good evening, I'm János Molnár, Scientific Fellow in the Budapest office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the New Equality team and the FAS team. The political economy of Hungary from state capitalism and authoritarian neoliberalism. It is the title of the book of Ádám Fábry we will discuss today. The title helps us to identify the real dimensions we will be moving in today in our discussion. It is not just the simple framework of the political economy, not even just the model dimension. The horizon of our talk today is the process of model changes in the political economy of Hungary. Which interests have driven the emerging models? The critical analysis of the starting and the final, the state capitalism and the authoritarian neoliberalism signal the clear and consequent value background of the author. Not just the unusual holistic approach of the understanding. A strong value fundament is characteristical for his discourse. The holistic understanding and the consequent value fundament create a positive synergy which leads to concrete new statements in most of the discussed issues. A great representative of a new economist mentality. With our chair, Zoltán Pogátsa, and with our two other panelists, Gabor Sharing and Katalin Ferber, we have a great new mentality spectrum in our event today. I wish all of us open minds for the holistic framework and sensibility for the value fundament to get the most possible takeaways from their discussions. Thank you for all of us for being with us today.
Thank you very much, János, for these introductory words. My name is Zoltán Pogátsa. I'm the editor-in-chief of New Equality magazine. A few words in Hungarian. Ha önök angolul hallgatják, de magyarul szeretnék, akkor tolmácsolás van, át kell kapcsolniuk az interpretation gombra, a japánra kell kapcsolni, mert ebben a rendszerben magyar sajnos nincsen, de a japán az a magyar, az angol, tehát váltsanak át, hogyha magyarul szeretnék hallgatni. This was just a short announcement about interpretation. I'd like to welcome all of you for this very special event today, discussing Ádám Fábry's book. Just a brief introduction from my part about what is going to happen today, and then I'll give the floor over to our participants, whom I'd like to welcome. First of all, the author of the book, Ádám Fábry, and I have to say that although this is a Hungarian panel, it's actually a very international panel at the same time, because our author, Ádám, is sitting in Argentina, of all places, where he is teaching at the University of Cordoba in Argentina. Ádám, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Zoltán.
And our two discussions, although Hungarian, are also sitting outside of Hungary. First of all, we have Katalin Ferber, who is an economist, and she's, if I'm not mistaken, in Berlin. Thank you, Katalin, for accepting our invitation. And our other discussant is Gabor Sharing, who is an economist and a sociologist, and he is sitting somewhere in Italy. Thank you, Gabor, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
So these three people will be our participants, the author and the two discussants. What's going to happen is I'll shortly give the floor over to Ádám, who's going to introduce the main thesis of his book briefly, and then we'll hear two discussions of the book from Katalin and Gábor, after which I'll pass the floor over to all those of you watching us and listening to us, and you'll get a chance to ask questions. Before I do that, a few technical issues. This discussion is being recorded, so it will be made available on the internet through the online platform of New Equality, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Budapest. It's also being live streamed, so there are people watching now through the internet, through Facebook. The difference is that if you're watching through Facebook, you will not get a chance to ask questions. If you want to ask questions, you have to join in the event. You find an event link, and through the link, you can join us in Zoom, and then you get a chance to ask questions. There are two ways of asking questions. One of them is through the chat function. So at the bottom of your screen, you see a chat function. If you type your questions in there, I'll try to include it in the discussion. And the other way, if you have a little bit more courage, then the other way of participating is once the discussants have told us their views of the book, you can directly ask a question. We can basically input you with your voice, probably with your screen as well, but definitely with your voice, and you can ask questions to any of the three participants. I think I've said everything that needed to be said at the beginning, all the technical issues, and with that, I think I just want to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for the cooperation in organizing this event. And I think most of you are waiting actually for Ádám to present his book. So I will not waste any more time. Ádám Fábry, author of the book, can you please summarize the main thesis of your book in about 10 to 15 minutes? Ádám, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, János and Zoltán for those kind words and for inviting me to this great event. I have prepared a few slides, PowerPoint slides, to convey my message with you. I hope you are able to see those slides now. So basically, to begin my argument, I think for those of you that haven't had the possibility yet to read the book, it might be a good idea to start off by describing what are the main questions that the book seeks to answer. And they are primarily three main questions. The first is how we can explain the relatively rapid and peaceful transition that took place in Hungary in the late 1980s from socialist and actually existing socialism to free market capitalism. The second question is how we can explain then afterwards the uneven development of the Hungarian economy from 1990 up until the global economic crisis in 2009, which, as most of you will know, impacted very severely on the Hungarian economy. And thirdly, how we then subsequently can explain the ascendancy and consolidation of the Orbán regime, which I in the book describe as a specific form of authoritarian neoliberalism. So those are the main questions that the book seeks to answer. And with regards to these questions, the book makes five main claims. And the first claim is a critique of the mainstream theories that have been that dominate the literature on the transformation, not only in Hungary but elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. And with regards to these theories, my critique centers on three specific points. Firstly, the fact that mainstream theories, they tend to be based, they tend to employ a static comparative approach towards transformation. And this is best exemplified through the idea that they assume that there was a sharp division between the capitalist West and the communist or socialist East during the Cold War. And then these differences can then explain the developments taking place in Central and Eastern Europe following the transition from 1989 onwards. And I think that theoretical approach is unable to answer some of the problems that we have seen emerging in Hungary and elsewhere in the region, both after 1990, but it also is unhelpful in terms of identifying and explaining the ascendancy of neoliberal ideas in the region. So mainstream theories tend to explain the ascendancy of neoliberalism either as a case of voluntary adaptation of local elites, or a more critical argument tends to be that these neoliberal ideas and practices, they were enforced upon the region by hegemonic Western states and international financial institutions. And in the book, I spend a great deal of time both arguing theoretically against these explanations, and also I spend a whole chapter analyzing the domestic origins of neoliberalism in the case of Hungary, which I identify primarily with the people involved with the Financial Research Institute, or as it was known in Hungarian, the Pénzügyi Kutatási Intézet. And third and finally, I think that mainstream theories have spectacularly failed again and again to explain the different anomalies of the transformation. And here one good example is the case of the so-called illiberal revolution that we have seen sweeping the region since 2010, which the most common explanations to this process has been either that this is a result of historical legacies. So for instance, the persistence of feudal cultural values, which allegedly favor authoritarian populist politics and so on and so forth, or the idea in the case of Orbán and Kaczynski, for instance, that their personal characteristics somehow differ from those of liberal democratic leaders in the West, and then thus explain the rise of authoritarian politics in the respective countries. And what I think all these explanations do is that they assume that there is a sharp theoretical division between neoliberal capitalism and authoritarianism, and hence in the explanations that they offer, neoliberalism has nothing to do with the rise of authoritarian politics. And the last chapter of my book, I seek to demonstrate that this is not only mistaken, but actually neoliberalism has very much to do with the rise of or authoritarian politics. So the second point relates to different ways in which I think a critical Marxist perspective can be helpful in explaining the transformation. And there, the main points that I make with regards to this is that my approach seeks to break with the methodological nationalism that has dominated in the literature on the transformation. So I seek to develop a global political economy explanation of the transformation, which argues that this process needs to be understood in relation to wider changes in the capitalist world economy since the 1970s. And this is the emphasis here on the transformation of the capitalist world economy, a restructuring in which neoliberalism has come to the ascendancy and consolidated itself over different types of national capitalist models. The third claim of my book is that, of course, as a Marxist approach, I try to bring class back in. And when I speak of class, I'm not only referring to the political and economic rivalry between capital and labor, but also between different fractions of capital and different states. And that point relates strongly to the fourth claim of my book, namely that we need to pay a stronger attention to the role of the state in the development of Hungary and the transformation of Hungary and other countries in the region. And so probably one of the most controversial claims of the book is that the Soviet-style regimes that existed in Central and Eastern Europe prior to 1989, they were contrary to the official message coming out from Moscow and elsewhere. They were actually not socialist states, but represented a specific form of state capitalism in which the state bureaucracy was acting as the agents of capital in their respective countries. And I think that claim is very important because it helps me to identify the domestic origins, the domestic actors involved in the promotion of what I call proto-neoliberal ideas and practices in Hungary prior to 1989. And that is probably one of the most important arguments of the book, actually. And finally, I also emphasize that capitalism is an inherently uneven mode of production, which is driven by contradictions and crises, and that ruling classes, they are continuously struggling to deflect the external and internal pressures, both in space and time. And this, I think, is helpful, especially when we analyze many of the policies implemented by the Orbán regime in order to overcome the negative impacts of the 2009 global economic crisis on the Hungarian economy. So this said, if we apply this framework then to the Hungarian economy from the late 1940s to the present day, then I think we can identify, and in the book I basically identify three main periods, and the first one being that of state capitalism in between the late 1940s and the late 1980s, in which Hungarian leaders, of course, under strong pressure from Moscow, implemented the main features associated with Soviet-style state capitalism. So centrally planned economy, the key sectors of the economy were nationalized, accumulation was heavily geared towards heavy industry and so on and so forth. And this economic regime was accompanied with an authoritarian political regime in which the party state dominated all political relations. At the same time, however, I stress in the book that the state capitalist regime in Hungary promoted progressive ideas, or promoted, in theory at least, the emancipation of the working class and the peasantry, and also many of the policies implemented, at least until the 1970s, contributed to an upward mobility in society, which had hitherto been unknown. However, as the Hungarian economy entered into increasing crisis from the early to mid 1960s onwards, this opened up a space in which what I call proto-neoliberal ideas and practices could emerge, such as the new economic mechanism or the Financial Research Institute, which I demonstrate in the book, played a key role in the transition to neoliberal capitalism in the late 1980s. And then the second period is a period of pure neoliberalism, we can say, in which the new economic model that was promoted favored the arrival of foreign capital, which was supposed to contribute to economic growth, higher living standards, and so on and so forth. This economic model was accompanied on a political level by the introduction of liberal democratic institutions, primarily through technocratic elites associated with the center left, but also with the center right. However, the neoliberal economic model contributed to rising social and regional inequalities in society, and basically these inequalities they erupted with the global economic crisis in 2008-2009, and the specificity of the Hungarian case was that it was not only an economic and social crisis, but following Gramsci, I argue that it was the 2009 crisis was an organic crisis in which the ruling center-left parties faced a crisis of legitimacy, and this then enabled the rise of Viktor Orbán from 2010 onwards, with a 2/3 supermajority, as most of you will know. And when it comes to the Orbán regime, the last chapter of the book makes the case that although Orbán and his supporters claim that they have broken with neoliberalism, actually there are very strong continuities with the neoliberal policies implemented prior to 2010. The one main important difference, I think, is that the Orbán regime seeks to provide authoritarian fixes, authoritarian solutions to the contradictions arising from this economic model. So there I refer to, for instance, the gerrymandering of electoral maps, the introduction of a new constitution, or the promotion of ethnicist and racist ideas and practices which are supposed to co-opt and or gain the consent of popular masses in society. So very roughly and briefly, that is the summary of my book. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Ádám, for this, I think, very useful and very concise summary of a very, very long book with a lot of detail. And it's not easy, I realize, to summarize such a complicated a book in such a short, brief period of time. So thank you. I think you've done a great job of that. I also noticed a long time ago that the only people who use the word hitherto are Marxian social scientists, and that you did use that word. So you're a good Marxian social scientist, I think. Now, with that, over to Katalin. You have about 10 minutes to tell us your opinion of the book. Katalin, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the possibility and the opportunity. First of all, which is contrary to many academics, I would like to stress that I like very much the book. I read twice, and my heartful and mindful congratulations to Ádám, because it's not only filling a very, very deep loophole, but also, meanwhile, I was reading second time, I was thinking, how could I teach this? I'm sorry for this kind of idea, but then when I'm reading an academic book, it's a very important question for me, whether could I teach it or it would be impossible. So I think this is really the political economy of the Hungarian economic history in the last 4 decades, at least. Now, instead of being absolutely obsessed by tiny details and tiny detailed questions, I would like to suggest a few things, both methodologically, and I can't help, but I'm an economic historian and also financial historian. So what I a little bit missed is the financial aspect. I'm aware that there are plenty of articles, books, monographs, including in Hungarian and in English and many other languages, but together with the financial layout of this shift, actually from the end of the 60s, would be beneficial, I think, both for the readers and for other economists and economic historians, specifically because if we name it, Hungary after the oil crisis, or meanwhile the oil crisis, started the indebtedness. And more Western debts were, and the 3 near moratoria situations actually were forcing even the party leadership to bring back the new economic reform situation. Now, but that is really detail, so it doesn't question the significance of the book and the fundamental statements and conclusions of the books. Now, funnily, I may recommend, because this book, Ádám's book, helped me to rethink many times the Cold War, the, so to speak, economic Cold War, which means the regimes, the bad and the good, you know, like in a medium level of Western film, the bad and the good. The good wins, the bad should die. Now, since Ádám mentioning not once, but several times the state capitalism, and in this brief summary also appeared this expression, I would like to suggest, it's just an idea, that how about questioning, these good and bad kind of economic systems, the weight of the state and the weight of the state capitalism and the weight of state capitalist institutional networks. Now, of course, the weight of the state is not purely my idea. There was a book, and there is a book entitled The Weight of the Yen. But the point probably could stress that this is a question of how the state and its institutional networks enhancing various levels of developing countries or even medium developed economic systems. Now, that's my first kind of idea, which came thanks to Ádám's book. Now, the second one is the state capacity. That is a very, very, very well-researched area where we could help to redefine what market economic system is, what state-enhanced market economic system is. And of course, I can't help, but I heavily rely mentioning the state capacity. The original term was invented by Linda Weiss, an Australian economist, and having a monograph, a very good one, written by her. But of course, she overwhelmingly used the East Asian various systems to redefine state capacities instead of market and non-market economy, which has no meaning actually anymore if we understand how East Asia developed in the last 4, 5, 6 decades. Now, I'm not saying that my final point, but so to speak, the middle final point, my fundamental question to Ádám, and that is that is it really true that this was from the 60s? I think the most important literature on that, this is really true that Hungary and partially the Czechoslovakian economy and partially Poland as attempt and failed attempt really became kind of familiar to these neoliberalistic ideas and implemented as a kind of unavoidable force, because my idea slightly differs from Ádám and many other social scientists' statement in this sense, namely that only the economic sphere was where it was allowed and relatively easily being able to advocate, because nobody used to be able to touch the political system in the whole region. So because the economy was in trouble, therefore the party, certain members, flexible members, were able to accept as the last resort the limited market forces existence as incentives, motivations, etc. Now, this is only a question. It's not a statement. I'm not sure that I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, finally, Ádám summary included these so to speak, I don't remember precisely the expressions, but this neoliberalism has to do a lot with the authoritarian system and the rise of the authoritarian system. I hope I'm quoting correctly. Now, I fully agree, but my question is, reading Adam's book, now, why is that? Because I do think that why the, so to speak, under the one-party system or state capitalistic system, the opponents were very, very receptive and adaptive toward certain market ideas. In my limited understanding, it was an economic democracy creation. If we democratize, marketize, which was the same in their mind, which is not the same as we know, if we marketize the economy, that marketized economy would and should create political democratic system. Now, that was fatally a mistake. It was absolutely wrong, because we know so many, so to speak, marketized or even economically democratized system without any or very limited, narrowly understood and narrowly practiced political democracy. So I think that's all. And once more, thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the book.
And thank you, Katalin, for your opinion and having read it and having told us what you think about the book. Thank you. Our other discussant is Gabor Sharing. Now, those of you who are watching us for the first time, you don't know, but those of you who have been watching these discussions, you will have realized that this is a series of discussions, and I'm not going to list all the authors with whom we have talked, but one of them is Gabor Sharing, who is the author of a book that is at the same time similar to Adam's book, but there are also fundamental differences. The title of his book is The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, Authoritarian Capitalism and the Accumulative State in Hungary. So I'm especially curious now to listen to Gábor, and I'm sure Ádám is also, because there are parallels between the two books, but there are also significant differences. Both are about how we got to the Orbán regime and the previous decades, but I am sure there will be differences. Gábor, over to you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I also like to congratulate Ádám for this book. I think it's a hugely important contribution to our understanding both of the current regime that Hungary lives in today, but also of the transformation of real existing socialism that you call in your book state capitalism. So first, I'd like to summarize the three most important contributions of your book, making some comments on them, trying to contextualize them further. Then I will have one slide point of critique, and then I just have a question for you to deliberate on further if you have time. So I think, as I've said, it's a hugely important contribution, and I cannot underline it enough that I think everyone who wants to understand what has happened to Hungary should read this book. It's a very concise summary of a very complex history of a political economic history of Hungary, and I agree with almost with the like overwhelming majority of your argument, and there will be only small points where I see the story a bit differently. So first, I think your very important contribution is that Hungary's neoliberal turn under Orbán and Orbán's authoritarian response cannot be solely explained by the unique characteristics of Hungary. And both the neoliberal transformation of the previous state socialist regime and Orbán's regime, the rise of Orbán's regime, were shaped by the wider global economic neoliberal restructuring of the capitalist world economy. I think this is really crucial, because if one looks at the literature, it's changing. Also, the Hungarian literature, we are seeing an emergence of new political economic explanations and narratives. But still, like around 90% of the literature on Orbán, and I think 99% of the mainstream media coverage of Orbán and what has happened to Hungary seeks the answers in Orbán's personality, his tactical maneuvers, or maybe Hungary's supposed anti-liberal cultural legacy. And you very clearly question these explanations. And I fully agree with you. On the one hand, this one-sided emphasis on politics, what Pierre Bourdieu called political fetishism, which is, I think, a really nice term to capture this one-sided emphasis on political actors, is intellectually misleading, as you show in the book. And the cultural explanation is also problematic intellectually, but also it's politically highly counterproductive because of its built-in elitism. And then you're very right to juxtapose your political economic alternative to this. I also think it's really important that you show that the failure of real existing socialism cannot be only explained by internal contradictions of these regimes. But we have to set it again in the context of global capitalist transformations. And you're very right to point out that in different regimes that we wouldn't call like socialism, or haven't called themselves socialism, like regimes in Latin America, these import substitution developmentalist regimes, they were facing very, very similar problems after a phase of extremely successful modernization after the Second World War. These modernization efforts run into problems during the 70s and exploded basically by the end of 70s, early 90s with the global debt crisis. And Hungary and many other countries in Eastern Europe are facing very, very similar challenges. And you look at this and you say that this is a very important part of the story. And then your second contribution, which is again very, very important and highly relevant to understand what was going on in Hungary, is that neoliberalism was not simply imported. Even critiques of neoliberalism tend to portray it as something that is, forced on countries by the IMF, the World Bank, and all the American star economists as we know them, and then Jeffrey Sachs comes and then destroys these countries. And of course, I'm not trying to evade blaming these and trying to identify these actors as being responsible for the neoliberal reforms. But it's very true, as you highlight, that the way neoliberalism emerged was a dialogue between Eastern European economists and Western economists. And that's a very important story. And I fully agree with you. And I think the part that I enjoyed in your book most was your story about the Financial Resource Institute and how those guys back in the 70s and 80s especially changed the economics discourse. And especially I'm reading today, I've just finished writing a review of Isabella Weber's book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. I don't know if you've read it. It's a brilliant book. And your book basically could be titled How Hungary Succumbed to Shock Therapy. So it's a very interesting contrast between China and Hungary. So, and again, you're showing how these domestic forces were very, very important. And this is also important to understand that policy paradigms have power and they can further economic and political interests. And you're showing that this alliance between neoliberal economists and the late Qadarist technocracy was crucial for the power of neoliberal ideas. And I think then this really highlights whether an alternative to neoliberalism has a similar social coalition behind it at the moment in Hungary, or how can such a social coalition be built? And is there really an alternative policy paradigm at all ready in Hungary to be implemented? I think that's one of the questions that emerges from your reading of Hungary's story. And then you introduce this notion of authoritarian ethnicist neoliberalism as a description of the Orbán regime, and you are one of the key frontrunners of this argument that neoliberalism hasn't died under Orbán. And I fully agree with this. And I've also started to identify Orbánomics as a version of neoliberalism, as a national populist mutation of neoliberalism. And we use slightly different terms, but it's basically the same phenomenon. And I think it's very, very important to realize that populism and neoliberalism, although they are often portrayed as opposites, they are not. And Orbán himself very cleverly amplified these perceptions that he is opposed to the IMF, and many social scientists both this, but this is, I think, just a smokescreen. And behind this facade, most important aspects of neoliberalism, as you show in the book, has continued. It also follows that Orbánomics is not some irrational set of random policies, and it's also not just a simple power grab. And you offer a very important critique of the mafia state thesis with that regard. So this is the third very important contribution. So this is basically the whole story of your book. And I have one slide point where I diverge. And this is the notion of state capitalism. And I'm not convinced whether we can use that to describe the pre-89 regime in Hungary. I fully appreciate the left-wing tradition that criticizes real existing socialism, saying that it is state capitalism, and it has little to do with socialism. And I also appreciate your effort and the intellectual maneuver trying to trace the interest that facilitated the emergence of proto-neoliberal ideas. And using state capitalism as a notion allows you to do that. So while I share these motivations, but I'm not convinced that this definition is really it's just not works. I think, because I think even from a Marxist perspective, I think the way Marx would define the capitalist mode of production would involve private ownership of the means of production, wage labor, and production for exchange, mostly using inputs gained through exchange. And I think in these real existing socialist economies, there was, of course, very little private property. Exchange relations were thoroughly embedded in decommodifying social regulations and the central system of allocation of capital and inputs for production. So market exchange was very, very constrained. And labor, although labor was waged, but again, labor market competition was close to non-existent, and access to basic public goods was guaranteed. So I think this diverges to a degree from the way even Marx would define capitalism, that I don't see how this, just simply by saying that because workers were alienated from the means of production, this is capitalism. If we take being alienated from the means of production as a definition of capitalism, then feudalism would qualify as capitalism, because serfs were alienated from the means of production land, but we wouldn't call it capitalism. I don't think we will be able to resolve this debate now. It's just something that I wanted to flag, and with all the comments that I made, that I if I understand it right, I think the motivation, I share the purpose of why you're using this notion. And finally, a question to you, and basically to us who mostly portray a structuralist account of Hungary, this is something that I'm also always struggling with, trying to build in other aspects that sort of loosen up a little bit the structuralist framing. So basically, you are drawing a line from disenchantment with neoliberalism to the rise of ethnicist authoritarian neoliberalism under Orbán. And I agree with the centrality of this structural story. If you look at how contemporary authoritarian regimes are emerging and neoliberalism is mutating around the world, there are crucial variations in how different countries respond to the crisis of neoliberalism. So in some countries, you have a more decisive break with neoliberalism, whereas in other countries, you don't see much of a break. So that this begs the question, what explains these divergences? You know, like in Greece, there was a left populist experiment. In Poland, you have a nationalist government that goes, I think, more strongly against neoliberalism than Hungary. And we need to look at the social coalitions that allow us to explain these differences. Now, social coalitions are, of course, embedded in the structural story that you're suggesting. So I don't think that this is an alternative explanation, but I was just wondering how you would, if you were to write a second book, let's say, how would you extend your story to cover other cases, and how do you extend the macrostructure story to explain these differences? So with that in mind, again, I'd just like to congratulate for this book to you, which is, I think, a hugely important contribution to the social science literature on Hungary, with direct political relevance as well, to construct a viable democratic socialist or social democratic alternative to neoliberalism. So thanks for writing the book.
Thank you very much, Gábor, for your opinion. Serbs were definitely not alienated from their means of production, but we will have a chance to discuss that one-on-one, Gábor, I'm pretty sure. I will go back into my role as a moderator, and I will now pass the floor back to Ádám. Both Katalin and Gábor have posed certain questions in their discussion of your book. We don't have that much time, so we'll have to force you to be even briefer than you were before, about 5 minutes, which I realize doesn't do justice to the questions, but there are already people waiting. And if you look at the chat, there are already people asking questions through the chat, and I'm sure that there are people who will want to ask questions directly as well. So can you please try to first answer these two questions posed by the discussants, and then we will open up the floor as soon as we can to the audience. Over to you, Ádám.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katalin and Gábor, to your comments and criticism of the book. It is true that I mean, I didn't mention that, but I mean, the book is based on my PhD thesis, which I wrote between the late 2000s and 2014, and especially up until that period, the literature on the transformation, not only in Hungary but in general in the region, was extremely dominated by either neoliberal or what I call institutionalist explanations. So while it is true that in the last decade we have seen the emergence of more critical literature, that literature was very, very limited when I was writing my thesis. So hence I didn't have the possibility to interact with, for example, with Gábor so much in the time that I was writing my thesis. I'm sure the book would have benefited more of those type of discussions, but nonetheless, if I will try to focus on a couple of questions which have been raised by Katalin and by Gábor. I think one is, of course, it's inevitable that it's going to be raised, is the question of my employment of the concept of state capitalism, no? Which is extremely controversial. It's a minority view up until this very day, especially in Hungary, not necessarily so much elsewhere, but I understand that in Hungary it is very much a minority view. And I mean, my approach to this, my embracement of this term is basically based on the following argument. First of all, it refers, it is based on the idea of what do we mean by socialism, no? Because I think if we define the regimes in Eastern Europe as state socialist somehow, no, then we need to have some form of what is the idea of socialism. Is socialism simply equal to the fact that we have a regime arriving to power through the help of the Red Army, principally, which then claims to represent the interests of the working class and the popular masses, but every time that the working class and the popular masses rebel against the policies implemented by their leaders, they're brutally oppressed. I have difficulties with embracing that view of socialism. And then, of course, the counter argument that is being made is that, well, you know, but under the Kadar regime and you know, elsewhere in the region, these regimes implemented progressive social policies which favored the working classes. I don't deny that, but so did the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, for instance, for more than 50 years. And we don't call that, I mean, Trump calls Sweden a socialist state, but I don't think we would call Sweden a socialist state necessarily. So that is my argument on the one hand. And on the other hand is, of course, then the question of how do we interpret capitalism? Is capitalism simply the existence of private property relations, or is it something deeper than that? And is capitalism something, a mode of production that is evolving over time, hence not necessarily the same as the way Marx identified England in the 19th century? But for instance, we have to admit, I think, in our analysis, that the state has over the last century and a half, the state has come to play an increasingly important role in economic development, and I think that then forces us to at least question whether or not you know, the regimes that developed that came to power in Eastern Europe and ruled until 1989, whether they did not in the end have a lot of characteristics that were similar to those states that were on the western side of the Berlin Wall. So not only the alienation of labor, but also the oppression, I'm referring to the oppression of the working class and the popular masses, the existence of a money economy, and I mean, of course, I agree with Zoltán that, you know, under feudalism, the serfs were not alienated from their means of production, but also we have to ask, for instance, if we say that that capitalism necessarily involves private property, then where do we put, for instance, slavery in our scheme of explaining capitalism? I mean, were the slaves that worked on the plantation fields in the Caribbean, for instance, didn't they contribute to the development of capitalism as a global mode of production? So those are just some of some counter arguments that I'm throwing back there to perhaps help the discussion a little bit. Another important point, which partially relates to this, I think, was the point raised by Katalin about how the economic and the political sphere was different in Hungary, how it was conceived differently by for example, both external analysts, but also the political actors in Hungary. And I mean, I think there the Financial Research Institute played a key role in opening up the discussions about the economic sphere, but translating those discussions into discussions about opening up the political sphere. And I find it found it very interesting that, for instance, I carried out interviews with many of the actors involved in the Financial Research Institute, and with very few exceptions, Ebert is one of them. With very few exceptions, they were not necessarily interested in so much democratizing society as actually facilitating a transition towards what we want to call it, free market capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, whatever. That was their main interest, and they said so. They say so openly. So I mean that is something that I found very interesting in my research. And then as for the final question that Gabor raised about the divergence in different models of neoliberalism, or different responses to the crisis in neoliberalism. It's interesting because we seem to be unconsciously sort of heading in the same direction in our research without necessarily communicating too much with each other. But I'm also sort of tempting these days to go along the question of emphasizing the importance of how different social blocks, following Gramsci, how different social blocks can emerge and develop an alternative economic model to neoliberalism. I think the cases you mentioned, Greece is interesting actually in the sense that there a social bloc against neoliberalism was absent, in the sense that the ruling the national capitalist class was completely uninterested in this. In the case of Poland, it is opposite, because we have seen, especially I think Marek Nacik wrote a very interesting piece on this recently, on how the national capitalist class in Poland, but also, I mean, Gábor has written excellent stuff about this in the case of Hungary, how Orbán has been able to construct an alternative social bloc which incorporates important segments of not only the national capitalist class, but also workers and the poor in the case of Hungary. So yeah, those would be my comments.
Okay, thank you very much for these answers, Ádám. We will continue with the questions from the audience. I'll read some of those questions that I have found in the chat box. In the meantime, if you have questions that you want to pose directly to the three participants, then put your hand up in the participants box. So you go to participants at the bottom of your screen, and there's an opportunity to raise your hand. If you raise your hand, I will give you the floor afterwards. I see one person, Rita Schmidt, already raising her hand, but there might be more people. So we'll wait a little bit, and then in the meantime, I'll read some of the questions from the chat box. László Árva, I would like to ask the cause of the sudden transition between 1989 and 1990 from state capitalism or socialism to neoliberalism, and the similarly rapid transition in Central Eastern Europe to illiberal states, Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, etc. What are the causes of these transitions happening all over the region so rapidly? There's another question from Peter Szegvári. If I understood well, you all agree that in Hungary, what happened was a transition from fake socialism to fake liberal capitalism. Jakub Wojcik, I would like to ask about your opinion on the influence of transformation from state capitalism to neoliberalism on the development of right-wing extremist organizations like MIEP, Jobbik, etc. Does this economic transition create conditions favorable for such organizations in Hungary and other CEE states more than in liberal democracies in Western Europe? Stefano Bottoni, I'm listening to this very interesting discussion. Congratulations for the event and the book. And Balázs Fenyvesi, is there a chance in the future that the book would be published in Hungarian? Are there any such plans? To the last one, I can add that no, the book has not been published yet, unfortunately, in Hungarian. But if there is anybody in the audience who is a publisher would like to sponsor the publishing of this book in Hungarian, please get in touch with us, because we would be very happy if the book would be published in Hungarian as well. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's only available in English. So with these questions, we go back to Ádám. And in the meantime, if you feel like asking a question, don't forget to raise your little hand in the attendees box, the participants box, and then I will give the floor to you afterwards. But now back to Ádám and the questions from the chat box.
Thank you very much for those questions and comments. With regard to the first question about the causes of the rapid transitions in Hungary and elsewhere in the region, I can recapitulate my argument. Basically, I see these transitions in the case of 1989 as an accumulation of crises. We have the economic crisis of the state capitalist regimes, which dates back to the 1960s. A small point within brackets there is that the crisis and the different forms that it takes on the eastern side of the Berlin Wall is not necessarily that different from the crisis that we see on the western side of the Berlin Wall from the 1970s onwards, or as Gabor mentioned, in many of the Latin American countries from the late 1970s onwards. Bracket closed. So the rapid transition in the 1989 is an accumulation of economic crises coupled with a political crisis, not only within the ruling, within the party state in Hungary, but a political crisis that is the crisis of the Soviet Union following its debacle in Afghanistan, and the emergence of forces promoting some form of economic and political reforms. I mean, in the case of Hungary, I identified the Financial Research Institute as key actors in promoting these ideas, but there are elsewhere in the region, there are other forces that can be identified as well. And so the coming together of these different processes and forces facilitate the rapid transition in 1989. In the case of 2010, especially in the case of Hungary, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's the case of the devastating impact of the global economic crisis on the Hungarian economy and on society, with unemployment reaching record levels in late 2009, early 2010, together with the already existing political crisis, which dates back to the famous speech of then Prime Minister Gyurcsány, of course. And so the coming together of the economic, the political, and the social crisis, or what Gramsci termed an organic crisis, facilitates the rapid transition and emergence of Viktor Orbán and Fidesz. I mean, this term of fake socialism to fake liberal capitalism, I never thought about it in those terms. It's something that could be good as maybe if you want a short Twitter resume of my argument, but I didn't think about it in those terms until now, at least. And the final question about whether this transition facilitated the rise of right-wing extremism. Well, it did, in the sense that, I mean, as Gabor has shown in his research as well, and the transformation in Eastern Europe caused an immense amount of social distress, especially impacting on the industrial working classes. And these the working class was completely abandoned by the reformist socialist or social democratic parties emerging in the region after 1989. So we had throughout the region the case that the best disciples of neoliberalism were very often the socialist, the social democratic parties and their economists, who were allegedly representing the interests of the working class. And without any representation, then the working class very often, I mean, they're found political backing, and they're in the far right and in the hard right in the case of Fidesz. But what I want to say here is that it's not an inevitable story. I mean, it's a story that could have ended differently. I think if we would have had the emergence of alternative left-wing forces, which unfortunately in many cases have been absent in the region. But it wasn't an inevitable story.
Okay, thank you, Ádám, for your answers. We have a little bit of time left in case there are any of you who want to ask questions. There are two ways of doing this. One of them is you raise your hand in the participants box, and I give you the floor directly, and you can ask a question in audio, or if you, and so I'll be looking out for raised hands now. And the other way of doing it is directly type your question into the chat box, and then I can read it for the participants. And I see there's a hand, László Árva, Could we please give the floor to László Árva? I think, Laci, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Thanks. Okay. So anyway, I have to admit that I have another alternative answer to this sudden collapse of this regime of state socialism in this region, but I don't want to tell it because I started already to write something about it, and I am going to send you, Pogi, if you permit. And other questions I started to write, but I think it's much simpler to ask, do you mean that after this humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan, and also with other lots of, I don't know how strong or how efficient criticism of the American capitalism, starting from Bernie Sanders through Kamala Harris till the economists who were very critical, can we see a similar collapse of this system other side of the ocean or not?
Okay, thank you, László. This was a very direct question to Ádám, I suppose.
I don't want to end up with as someone who says answers A, and then in 2 weeks' time B will take place, and everyone will point the finger to me saying, "Look at this guy! What a complete mess he made of himself." I mean, I would be cautious in making. I would be cautious in making the claim that the U.S. is on the verge of, or U.S.-style capitalism is on the verge of collapse. I think what we're seeing is a slow, protracted transition in the world economy, in which China is emerging as a serious contender to the US. But I mean, I have difficulties. China so far has not wanted to confront the US in terms of militarily, for instance, and I think that the military power of the US still is so much more superior to China that the US would not retire quickly and voluntarily from its position as the world's hegemonic power. So I see that as a more protracted process. That would be my answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ádám. We got a question in the chat box in the meantime. This is from Melanie Heen. I am a PhD candidate in Germany and doing research on political regime transformation and the role of civil society. And I'd like to mention a point regarding illiberal transitions nowadays in the region. I believe on the one hand, the civil society was not well developed during the transitions in the 1990s in the region to stand as a steady fighter for democracy. This enables governments to tighten its space and therefore shrink possibilities for citizens to engage in politics and decision-making, which weakens the democratic regime, but supports other regime types and alien organizations. On the other hand, there is an ideology that Orbán follows of him being the only representative of Christian and conservative values, which he also brings to neighboring countries and other countries throughout the region, as we can see in Slovakia, Slovenia, but also in North Macedonia, where there is an influence of Orbán and the Fidesz party in the media landscape, just to name one example. A very detailed question, but I think the gist of it is to do with civil society and the role of civil society. I'm curious how a Marxian social scientist would answer a question about civil society. Ádám.
Wow. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it's a curious question because, I mean, allegedly, if you if you followed all the literature on the transformation in the 1990s and early 2000s, Hungary was supposedly the poster boy of this transformation. It was the model to follow, not only in economic terms, in terms of liberalization of the economy and so on and so forth, but also in political terms, in terms of introducing liberal democratic institutions, favoring civil society organizations and so on and so forth. But then from one day to another, this model collapsed. And so the question, I think, arises, what was, where, I mean, how can we explain this collapse? And is it enough only to have a well-developed civil society? If that was the case, I'm inclined to argue against that. Or is I mean the ensuring of democratic values something that is that requires much more than just civil society organizations, requires active, independent trade unions, requires for instance, an education system that is openly promoting critical thinking and so on and so forth. So I would be inclined to claim that the mere existence of the quality of democracy cannot be judged simply by the amount of civil society organizations existent in a country. I think the quality of democracy is something much more that requires other factors and social actors as well to be considered.
Thank you, Ádám. Gábor, Katalin, would you have anything to say with regards to the role of civil society? Katalin?
I'm slightly disagreeing with Ádám's opinion with the modification. The civil society in Hungary actually was very strong, actually the strongest one in the region. The civil society, however, learned one pattern: how to resist, how to boycott, how to, so to speak, stop the party central leadership decision in certain cases. There is a very, very rich and interesting literature on the 70s and 80s, how, you know, the civil society, part by part, both in the industrial layout and in the agriculture, started to resist against the party. But this is a negative civil society pattern. What not to do, how not to do, but not positive one. And because I still believe that political democracy, as you said earlier, was almost completely, with few exceptions, like Erzsébet Szalai and few others, from the economic reformist mind, the major part of the society, especially in practical sense, the resisting civil society groups in the society, which mainly were invisible, those people did believe that the rapid transformation creates for them both autonomy and economic democracy. And it didn't. And actually and that is my final remark, one of the negative sense brilliant idea and practice of Orbán was the polgári, the civic circles. After they have lost the election, Then they started to spread all over the society via these circles. And actually, it was nothing else but gathering informations for their own future. We know that proved by documents. So people who felt were left behind as the reminiscence of the autonomous groups and civil society-like groups, they were gladly joining to the civic circles, not understanding that this is actually from one-party center led, and leading and helping to have something completely the opposite result what they used to believe.
Okay, thank you, Katalin. Gábor?
Yeah, so I think with regard to civil society, for me, the first question is how we define civil society. What does it entail? And to me, I mean, I was a member of NGOs for 10 years, and I appreciate the work that these social movements do. But there is a liberal bias in the way mostly civil society is defined. And I think democracy tends to work in settings where there is a large segment of society that is interested in maintaining democracy as a compromise between different social coalitions and social forces. So people have to be interested in maintaining a democratic compromise. If there is no interest in doing that, then it will collapse. And it has collapsed historically in many cases where there were no such class coalitions that would be able to sustain democracy. And what I think happened in Hungary and in some other cases is that you had a kind of, in my book, I call it a top-down simulated democracy that worked it was implemented as a textbook project, building very nice institutions, the way the liberal democracy is supposed to work, but then the underlying social coalitions that would protect democracy as a kind of mechanism that aligns different interests was not developed. And here I think trade unions and other social movements that are central actors of the class forces beyond democracy are crucial. So if you mean that these aspects of class politics and social coalitions were weak, then I agree that civil society was weak. But if you mean that like NGOs were missing, I'm not sure I would agree with that, because I think Budapest has a very vibrant NGO scene, but it's completely disembedded mostly from the rest of the country. At least it has been until recently. There are very, very good efforts to change this, but before 2010, including my own NGO, that was the case. So I think historically, democracy has worked in countries where it worked as a class compromise, and as a class compromise, it has to be built on organized class actors like trade unions and other social movements that represent these interests. Otherwise, elites will just hijack the institutions of democracy like they did in pre-war Germany and institute a different kind of regime if there's no popular interest that would be able to fight for democracy based on material interests.
Okay, thank you very much, Gábor. I have some bad news. Our time is up. I'd love to continue this conversation because I think it helps us a great deal in understanding where we are, how we got here, and hopefully how we can proceed towards a different future. All of these books that you guys have written are very relevant. So I'd just like to encourage everyone again to take a look at Ádám's book. The title is The Political Economy of Hungary, From State Capitalism to Authoritarian Neoliberalism by Palgrave. Please take a look, and if you're interested, please read it also. So thank you very much, Ádám, for coming to Zoom today and talking to us. Excellent book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Also, thank you very much, Gabor Sharing, for taking the time to talk to us. The title of his book is The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, Authoritarian Capitalism and the Accumulative State in Hungary. You might want to take a look at that book as well, also by Palgrave Macmillan. And Katalin Ferber, thank you very much as well for taking your time in Berlin to be with us today. If you speak Hungarian, Katalin has a new book out. It's called Életálom. You might want to Google that book as well. Be surprised. Take a look and check out her book. Thank you, Katalin, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you.
Also, I'd like to thank the audience for having been with us today and the good questions that you have posed. You can help us by spreading the link. This video has already been streamed on Facebook, but will be posted on Egyenlőség, New Equality. If you think that if you think it would be worth it for other people to view this discussion, then you can help us by sharing the link with other people. And there's also a couple of other people that I'd like to thank, especially Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, for continuing to work with us in these discussion series. I'd like to thank Otto and Juliana, who were the translators today. Thank you very much for covering this entire event and translating it into Hungarian. There will be a Hungarian version made available on the internet as well with the voice of the translators. I'd like to thank András for the technical support and Péter for putting the event together with János. So thank you very much, especially for Ádám for having written this book. Take care of yourselves, and we will continue this series in the near future with more books about Hungary and the region. Bye-bye. Thank you.